Welcome to the Tech Enablement talk on technical onboarding. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Marco. I work with a company called Plus Plus, and we're going to be sharing some of the best practices. As we get going, I just want to give you a little bit of a background. So how did this talk come about? So I've personally done a number of launching technical universities at companies, both big and small. So including some of the logos of organizations you may know. And so these are some of the best practices observed. We have a program called Launchpad. So basically going into organizations and helping them get their usually onboarding first and then everything else launched as well. And I've worked at Twitter for a few years building Twitter University there. So that's when I kind of learned the ropes and then replicated that elsewhere. We also run a community called TechKnowCon. I see a lot of familiar faces from that community. And we often hear from people in the industry, so your peers, sharing best practices on how they do technical onboarding. And so there's actually a category there. I included a link there, and we'll be sharing this afterwards as well. But basically, this is what that looks like. So these are stories from people in the community, and some are from big organizations like Microsoft that onboards 1,000 engineers every single month. And some are from very small companies like Carbon Health that was at the time 5 engineers and grew to 90. So you kind of get a mixed bag of different stories. So the point is a lot of best practices that we're going to share come from learning from your peers in the industry. So with that, what do we mean by onboarding? So basically we defined it as getting from zero to competency. So assuming somebody comes into your organization who already has basic knowledge, so functional knowledge, right? So for example, you hire an engineer. What does it take for that person to be effective in your context? What are the things that take an engineer who is otherwise a competent engineer become a valuable member of the team in your organization? And so if you kind of unpack that, there are a number of things that make up to get to competency. Or also sometimes we refer this as getting indoctrinated in the way your organization works, right? So things that we include are such things like teamwork. How do we work? Tools. What does the stack look like? What does the industry look like if it's a specific industry that is somewhat obscure? And then if you have a complex product, or what does even a product look like, and how does it all tie together? So I'll give you an example. When we were at Twitter, our promise was that as we hire great talent, once they come in, they need to learn 2 things: how Twitter works and how we work at Twitter. So there's both the cultural aspect and as well as the technical and domain aspect. So that's what we mean by getting from zero being you're great at your craft, to competency being you're indoctrinated in the way of the organization. So with that, I just want to kind of reflect on this this idea that for effectiveness, it's really a product of 2 things. So it's a product of having great people and then having those people work well together, right? So if you kind of take a sports team as an analogy, and I love using Golden Gate Warriors as an example, obviously they hire great basketball players, but that's not the magic of why they win. The magic is because those players now learn how to play well together, right? And so it's the product of people and plays or playbooks that cause that effectiveness. So we're assuming you are bringing in great talent, and we're going to focus on what does it take that talent to be working well together so that they can be effective as a team. So the side effect of this, so if you do that well, the side effect is usually what we observe: 2 things. One is retention. So top performance, so your A players, they're going to stick around because they like personal growth, they like developing. And also, as you do that, you're going to create a recruiting brand. So your organization is going to become known as the place to work at. We have a company that spoke recently, Essence. It's also a customer of ours out of Montreal, and they were at the time a smaller company, and they knew that they wanted to build the brand for themselves in Montreal to be known as the place for any great technical talent to work at. And so building their Essence University was a means to create that brand and to be known as the place to work at. So that's a side effect of doing everything else well. So with that, another thing to consider when it comes to technical onboarding is also where it sits in the organization. And we've seen all sorts of different setups. One of the common and traditional setups is that HR owns it. So more specifically, HR usually has learning and development, and learning and development may carve out a role that is sort of dotted line to technical organization. And so now this role is there to serve tech org. And this is probably a very common use case. I would say my hunch would be 50% of the organizations do it that way. What we also see is that sometimes technical organizations, such as engineering, for example, or product, say, you know what, this is too important to just hand off to HR. They're dealing with other sorts of things. They're dealing more with leadership development and culture and things like that. We are going to own our own destiny. We're going to own engineering onboarding ourselves. And so this is a little bit, I would say, more progressive, modern approach where a VP of engineering often says, I'm going to fund this role, and then essentially hires a program manager or similar and has them own that. And there's, of course, a whole evolution of this. We talk about this in our other webinar, the overview of tech enablement. But essentially, it starts with sometimes with a volunteer. So somebody just raises a hand and says, I'll embrace this as a separate job that I have. Sometimes this person could be a TPM, technical program manager, or similar, or eventually gets funded. So what we are seeing more and more is that as organizations mature, and sometimes that's related to a size as well. So in other words, as organizations scale and mature, they dedicate an entire team to tech enablement. So a lot of customers we work with tend to be at that level where they have an entire team dedicated to helping their engineers and others be great at what they do. What we also see, which is not that great, is when there is no onboarding at the organizational level. So essentially, you join a team and it's up to the manager to own your destiny there. And so this was when I joined Twitter, this was definitely the case there, right? So there was no Twitter engineering per se. It was more like you join, the timeline team or the direct messaging team, or, this service or that tool, and so on. And so the problem with that, there are a couple of issues with that. First of all, every manager was doing things differently. So there was no consistency in terms of best practices, right? Secondly, you were onboarded onto a team, not into the org. And that essentially created siloed organization. So when I joined, one of the things that I talked to Dick Costel at the time, the CEO, he basically said, you know what, the vision here is to create a nimble organization. So to be nimble, people need to understand how not just one team at Twitter works, but how Twitter works, right? And so that had him also fund Twitter University as a way to solve that, which we did. And there are companies that have done that very well from beginning. So I'll use Facebook as an example, and we also have a case study on them. But Facebook is famous for, you don't join a team, you join Facebook engineering first, and they actually hold you there for 6 weeks or so. Until you learn enough about entire engineering, and then you pick your team. So essentially, as a new hire, you get this bird's eye view how the entire organization works, which is amazing. All right, so a couple of things to think about. in addition to that is, as you start your onboarding project, who is in your corner? What does your team look like? What are the stakeholders? So in other words, who owns this initiative? Usually it's a VP of engineering, who is driving it. That's probably going to be you or somebody on your team. Scheduling meetings and such. So there's a lot of sort of logistical work, and it's good to have somebody own that and help with that, like a great program manager is very helpful. Sometimes that's a TPM, sometimes again it's a volunteer who does all sorts of other things, or an EA even. But it's also important to think about the structures. So what's worked for us well is set up weekly meetings. So basically have we're going to be regularly syncing. It doesn't need to be long. Half an hour is fine a week, just to kind of make sure that we're moving the ball forward. Set up a channel of communication. So if a question comes up, there are things between weekly meetings that make it easy to discuss, and then have some kind of work tracking system. Well, we use Asana often, but anything will do, as long as you know what the work is and we can keep moving the ball forward. So this is sort of like a basics of project management, I guess, but it's a good reminder. So let's get to the actual game plan. So what are we doing here? So to create onboarding, we're going to focus or break it into 3 separate steps. They're distinct. So step number 1 is discovery. And this is usually uncovering what the pain is, to try to figure out, all right, so where are people tripping up? Like, what are the impediments of a new hire coming in and getting to that competency level? What does even competency mean, right? Different organizations define it differently. So once we have an idea of what that is, we're going to get into design, and this is basically brainstorming what is the best way forward. What's the roadmap to solving this? And ultimately, rubber meets the road, and this is where we actually implement the program. So we're going to look at each one of these steps separately, and I have some examples here. I want to actually show you what this looks like in practice, and I'll just put the slides. So bear with me here. So discovery, again, it's about uncovering what the actual real problem is. And so you essentially have 2 ways to do that. One is through qualitative, and the other one is quantitative. So I'll start with qualitative, which is basically interviewing people. When I came into Twitter, I just heard things are broken, but I didn't exactly understand what it means. And I was myself a new hire, so I didn't really understand the lingo or the history, or know where the bodies are buried. None of that sort of organizational stuff. So what I started doing is talking to a lot of people. And as we kind of did this multiple times, I realized that talking to people is very useful. But the question is, who do you talk to and how, and what do you ask? So I sort of broke it into distinct groups of people. And whenever we do one of these launch pads where we try to stand up a new technical university within a company, I usually ask for the following category groups of people. So leaders, this would be your VPs of engineering, CTOs, depending on the size of the organization. People, or your sponsor usually, that's sponsoring the onboarding program. They have a perception of what's going on, which often different than the experience of new hires. So new hires are people who recently joined, and by recently, it depends on how quickly you're growing. It could be last 30 days, last 60 days or so. Again, depends on the sample size of these people. I usually like to talk to a couple of people in each bucket, maybe a little bit more lopsided to new hires versus leaders in this particular case, but it really depends on case-by-case basis. Then we have all-timers. All-timers are, early people that have been there for a while. They actually understand the culture very well. And they also see the trajectory of the culture. They understand how it was when we were small and everyone sat at the same table, and how things have progressed. And they can tell you if it's going up or down or sideways, what's working, what's not working. So that's why I like to talk to them. And then there are technical leads. This is different than leaders, meaning they're usually TLs. They may not have any direct reports, but they're very opinionated about the stack. They can be opinionated about what's working, how the quality of code is either progressing up or down, etc., which is different than leaders who may see things more from a cultural and people effectiveness point of view. So I like to kind of triangulate these four groups of people. So leaders and new hires, and then old-timers and tech leads to get the data. Now, how do we go about that? This is usually what I do in my interviews. I usually ask them, and by the way, these interviews typically about 15 to 20 minutes. So it doesn't need to be long. It's not a huge ask. It's just a short conversation. And I usually start by, what is the role? How long have you been at the company to sort of get an idea which bucket that they fit, given the previous set of buckets. And then if it's somebody who got onboarded recently, it could be that it's a TL that joined in the last quarter or two. I would just ask them to reflect. What worked? What didn't? What would you have done differently, right? So I always ask about the onboarding for those who have had it recently. I may not ask this question for all timers just because it's sort of less relevant because it's been a while. Now, two of the most important questions where I spend most of the time is issues and inefficiencies and magic wand. So basically, I try to find out what do they observe is not working. Like what are they complaining about or wish it was different. And this is where I usually get a laundry list of things that are just not pretty. And then I ask them if they had a magic wand, what would they do differently? It's not often people have great ideas, but it's just not their job. And they just don't have anybody to own their great ideas. So this is a good way to kind of get ideas. I don't commit to any of their ideas. I just simply ask them, what do you think would work or not work, or how would you approach that? And sometimes you get this really great kind of insights. And then by correlating them to other people, you can get really good sort of suggestions for a way forward. So this is where we diverge before we converge. And then I would ask also, who else should they talk to? Because they also may know, other people in the organization who may not be on our initial list of people to interview. They were just not, whoever came up with that list didn't know. So let me give you an example of what this looks like. I have here just a raw Google Doc of some, an example. Names have been changed, but this was a discovery for a company that was doubling in size, so rapidly growing, and did not have much of a onboarding, deliberate onboarding per se, and they also operate in a complex industry with a complex product. So we wrote a little bit about discovery summary here, oops, actually I wanted to start here. I'm going to do this in the other order. So this is basically the list of raw interviews. So I got a list of names, and Will, Nabish, and so on. And you can sort of see how there's a little bit of a pattern to how I've been conducting these interviews. I would ask them about their onboarding experience, issues and efficiencies, magic wand. So let me find somebody, like, for example, this is Jack, and you can see a little bit of a, he's a professional services guy. This is another solutions architect. And let me see, like Jonathan is a PM, is a product manager. So I would basically ask him about his experience, issues and efficiencies, and then magic wand, and he would give me ideas. The stuff that's bolded is actually something that I would do afterwards. So this is my raw notes as I would just conduct the interview, and I would just sign up for, I would just write down the everything, and then I would bold afterwards things that stood out for me so that I can kind of look for patterns. One thing I also do when I do interviews, I record them so that they're transcribed. So like, for example, if I click on this, we use Scribe. So you can kind of see how this is an actual interview, and you can, I guess this one particular
fulfillment, order fulfillment in general.
So we basically record everything, and then I can go back to that particular thing and look for patterns as well. So you can see for this particular organization, we did about 1,000 or 2,000 interviews. So that's what that looks like, and so that gives me a really a very good qualitative data, lots of insights, lots of ideas from people we talk to. And again, it's a cross section of new hires and old timers and leaders and tech leads. Additionally, sometimes there's good data as well. So this is where it's a quantitative approach. Now, not every organization has this. I just kind of want to point out, I usually lean on interviews more to discover the problem. When it comes to gathering the data, for example, at Twitter, we had a ton of existing stuff. So we had thousands of projects across hundreds of repos, lots of stuff in various systems. Like we had Atlassian's QA system for questions and answers. So Git was there was a lot of stuff in there that was useful. We had the review board. So I was basically I would pour over all the data to understand where people tripping up, what's causing incidents, what's the blockage. Essentially, I was looking for impediments to development, and it was interesting as we sort of took this ball of wax that's all the projects, like I said, thousands of projects, you start realizing that there are certain things that sit at the core of what a lot of people use often, right? So I was looking for tools and libraries and systems that everyone uses, but are poorly understood. So for example, at Twitter, we would have our own build tool called Pants. Well, Pants, you wouldn't know unless you worked at Twitter. So and everyone needs to use it. So unless it's clearly defined how to use it, in other words, you're onboarded properly, you probably start creating anti-patterns. And then what people do is they would go on a wiki and search for like, hey, how do I do X? And it's not that we didn't have documentation, we had too much. You would find 10 answers from 10 very authoritative people that are different. And so now what do you listen to? So this is where onboarding becomes cargo culting, becomes sort of picking things from random spots, and it's just not a great experience and creates for you just embracing anti-patterns as a new hire. So not a good happy place. So so in other words, looking at systems like that, or sometimes there's a pulse survey, it becomes interesting to observe patterns in data. So in other words, quantitative approach to understanding the discovery piece of the designing the onboarding. So after that, what I would do is I would form hypotheses. I would basically look for those patterns, and I would try to understand like what might work in this particular context. So for example, for Omnicorp, this example, I created some hypotheses that we would, industry is complex. We should have something about industry. We should have something about case studies. Product was another thing that was very complex, lots of nuances, lots of things. So just even to be able to understand what the product we're working on is, we needed certain things. I would write up a little approach, and then I would define what possible content may look like. Just a bullet point at this point. So basically, we would have an overview. As you can see here, I had a hypothesis. And then once we evaluated it, we scraped it. It was a bad idea, but it was an idea. It was basically there up for debate, right, at the time. Then we had some ideas about product deep dives. And initially, this was one deep dive. Then we kind of decided, after discussion, we decided to split it up and so on. And so this is basically our hypothesis that after the discovery, I would create and then pitch to my onboarding team. So remember the importance of having the team and having regular syncs so that we can go back and present that. And just really briefly, I mentioned as I was forming these patterns, I would go through that and I would bold and look for patterns. This person told me this and I heard that elsewhere. That's interesting. There's something there to maybe double down and look into more. So there's a lot of sort of going back to the notes and even the recordings of the notes and trying to decipher what might work in this particular context. So that was forming the hypothesis, and then in terms of content, but also in terms of approach. So how would we approach this? Would this be a live learning, self-paced, blended? Would we lean on external knowledge, like buying a course off of LinkedIn.com or LinkedIn Learning, or hiring a vendor to do instructor-led training, or would it be mostly internal? Hint, it's usually mostly internal. But these are all things up for grab to discuss. And then we would obviously pitch it to validate. And so that's, again, this is what it's important to have the team so that you constantly in sync and there are no surprises at the end, right? So that's why I like my weekly syncs and being on the same page. All right, so we talked about the discovery. So now we sort of understand the problem. The next step is how do we design the solution? And I would start at the top. What are the playbooks? If you remember, the players and playbooks lead to effectiveness. So what are all the things that as a new hire I would need to know to be winning, right? To be competent. And so some examples, maybe, usually every organization has some form of engineering onboarding. So this is basically how the stack works and how to work on it. If you're a manager, you may need to know how we manage here, right? So it's a little bit of a culture piece. Leadership development. This is not just your typical HR stuff, but I'm also leaning on the technical part of leadership as well. So how do you lead technical folks? If you're hiring, there's usually some playbook for that. If your company is using OKRs, there's probably a playbook for that, and so on and so on. So this could be all one gigantic onboarding, or it could be broken into a number of things, some which you need to take right away, and some that may be available to you as you hit those points in your progression at the company. So for example, I may not be a hiring manager from day one because we're not yet hiring. So I can do that in month 3, for example. And just to kind of give you an example, I'm going to flip over to, this is just on ++, what that may look like once it's operationalized, right? So this is how it manifests in real life. So we call them, you can call them playbooks, some people call them tracks, but what you're seeing here is a number of such things. So setting goals with OKRs, leadership development, hiring manager playbook, etc., etc. And then here's the one that we mentioned on engineering onboarding. So I'll get back to this in shortly, but essentially it's like, as a new engineer, I would be expected to go through something like this. And then that playbook consists of a number of things that we'll look into afterwards. So, but we started by defining the playbooks. Next, it would be outlining what are the objectives. As a new hire, what would I need to know? So in this example of Omnicorp, I mentioned complex industry, complex product, and then the technical knowledge of how to actually work on this stack. So these would be the examples of what would be needed, what the learning objectives to kind of certify somebody that they're competent. So that may manifest itself here as I'll show you. So for example, for engineers, it may start with, this is engineering bootcamp. So you start there, and then you need to set up your development environment. And this is something that you do on your own, followed by, this is how we do AWS, followed by Docker. So these are all the things that as a new engineer, I may need to know. Some I would do on my own, like watch a video on Kafka. Some I would need to do in person. For example, security is something that is almost like a compliance related. So I would need to join either a live or in person event. So this is very much what a engineering bootcamp might look like in an organization that we would typically work with, like, thousands of people, engineers, for example. So choosing modalities. So this is one of the design decisions as well. So you have options. You can go lean on live courses. You can lean on self-paced courses. Or you can do the blend of two. There are pros and cons to each. Live is easy to launch. Usually instructors just show up and whiteboard stuff. It's usually considered less scalable if scale is important. Self-paced is very scalable, but it lacks it's hard to produce in stand-up, and it's harder to maintain the content, and it also lacks the human touch, which is important when you're onboarding someone into a culture, especially remotely. And usually the best is a combination of both worlds. We'll talk about that. So either way, to launch any of this, you would need to work with experts. So these are your usually internal subject matter experts. And there's some choices. Is it the manager, or is it the actual subject matter expert? And then is it a junior or senior? I usually ask for certain commitments so that they know how much time it's going to take. I try to make this as simple for them as possible so that it's not a big ask, because I understand that everyone else has their other main job to do as well. And then the question is, how do you get the approval from their managers? So these are some ideas. I usually tell their managers that they already have to support their internal customers, and that the cost of that support is not being accounted for. It's usually in the form of Slack channel and emails and so forth. So I basically say, hey, let's partner, and we're going to eliminate a lot of busy work that your team is already doing by standing up proper onboarding. So now when you have design, and by the way, at this point, design is usually Google Docs or Google Slides, something very lightweight. Now it's the matter of implementation. So how do you actually put this to practice? So we mentioned that there are different modalities, live versus self-paced. What we see, or often argue that is the best approach, is to start with live, with the goal of moving some things into self-paced so that we have blended experience. And so the reason for that is that live learning is the easiest to get going, right? It's quick and dirty. It's going to allow you to get up and running, which is what you want. So that's one thing. Secondly, since you're still learning where people are tripping up, having that live interaction gives you that feedback, right? Like you can actually observe, unlike in the, if it was self-paced content, with live learning, you can actually observe what's going on, and you can quickly iterate. So this is why we like starting here, running, maybe 1, 2, 3 classes live, and then bottling up things as they become stable. And then certain things are going to make sense, like setting up your environment is fine to do solo, but certain things you're going to want to keep also more of a cohort-based experience for cultural aspects. So I would set up initial session, pick the time, pick the presenter, and then run the program. And one of the key things that's important is to collect the data, because we want to close the loop. So closing the loop usually involves doing a retrospective. So what worked, what didn't, and what you would do differently. It's very helpful to have this discussion with your team, but also to be informed with data. So having surveys and having all that be integrated is very important, and then scheduling the next session so that you can optimize. So just kind of want to kind of wrap this up, what that may look like, all the things to kind of think about as you would need to implement or operationalize this onboarding that you designed, right? So a couple of things to think about. First is, how would you know who even needs to be onboarded? Like if you're a larger organization, there are people being added to your organization all the time. You want these people to automatically, ideally, be signed up for what they need to be signed up, as opposed to pushing spreadsheets from HR to you. So connecting directly to something like Workday is usually very useful. And then comes the knowledge, right? So how do you codify what they need to know, the new hires? And we mentioned you can codify it as live workshops, or you can codify it as self-paced content, but either way, it needs to be codified. And ideally, anyone can do their part to this, and it's not restricted to instructional designers. So this is where traditional learning management systems are not very useful, because they're so locked down. You actually want to democratize this approach to codifying the best practices, because they live all over the organization. Now, just dumping knowledge onto somebody is not enough. They need to be able to practice it. They need to be able to embody it, to try it out, right? So sometimes that's a cohort-based workshops. Sometimes that's something like code labs from Google, etc. But it's a way to actually try things out and practice it. So great, you learn stuff, you practice it. Now, when the rubber meets the road, you still need to be unblocked when you get blocked, right? So we all, once we actually start doing the work, we get stuck. And then the question is, how do we get unstuck? And there are different ways. What we see organizations do is provide a buddy system or office hours, or sometimes have more of a holistic coaching and mentorship program. But it's basically providing one way or another to unstuck people who are stuck, even though they took all the courses and training and everything else. And then we talked about closing the loop. And so that usually means through, it could look like through assessments, surveys. It's very useful if this data is integrated, so you can go back and slice it and dice it whichever way it works. And then finally, analyzing the data and possibly even involving a manager. So the managers own the development, their people. They tell us that this is something that is important to them. And so all this operationalized. I was using one example here of engineering onboarding. So you can kind of see how it may be a blended experience that starts with a live bootcamp, followed by self-paced set up your development environment, followed by another self-paced course on AWS, followed by another self-paced course, followed by a video. On-call is something everyone usually has. You may have a Google Code Lab that is, so your engineers created best practices for using particular parts of the stack. You may have another article followed by, in this case, this is another article. And you can even do compliance things, like everyone needs to be versed in privacy and data protection. And finally, maybe you close that with mentorship. You want people to actually pair up, have mentors or buddies, and so on. So just to kind of give you an illustration, when the rubber meets the road, what a program operationalized like this may look like. So with that, we are at the end, and I just wanted to see if anybody had any questions, comments. You can ask now, you can ask via chat. I'll also reach out to you afterwards, or me or Nick will follow up and see if you have any questions, and we'll share the slide deck so that you have all the links as well. So questions, comments, feedback, anything. The floor is yours.
I had a question. Ready to shoot?
Yeah, go ahead.
Can you go into another level or two of detail on how you go about building out code labs and practice activities?
Yeah, well, so Code Labs is a really cool product. It's basically a technology from Google that allows you to create. Let me show you. Let me give you an example of what that looks like. Allows you to create Code Labs in. You can do it two ways. You can do it either in code, so Markdown, or you can do it in Google Docs. But essentially, what it does is it democratizes who can create content. So if you think about like a learning management system, you need specialized tools with very few licenses and very few people in the HR department that know how to use it. So essentially it's off limits to everyone pretty much in engineering, right? Often, I'm kind of generalizing here. What Google did is basically said, well, why don't we democratize content creation so that anyone can create things? So for example, this is a code lab on building a progressive web app, and I can show you what that looks like. So what we do is we track assignments and manage who's taken it and do all the surveying and and all that kind of stuff on top of it. But the actual code lab looks like this. So I'm launching it here, and you can see it has this sort of familiar introduction, getting started, and it's very engineer driven. And like I said, it could be hosted in GitHub, zipped up into a zip file and loaded up, or it could come up straight out of a Google Doc. So anyone can maintain it and you can easily version it and democratize it and all that stuff. Does that give you enough sort of high level overview?
I think so. Tamar, who's with Cruz with me, do you have any follow-up questions on that, Tamar?
No, this is great. No follow-up questions that I can think of, but pretty interesting stuff. So I'll take a look at it.
Yeah, we're seeing a lot of interest on this. Like many technology companies, like engineers already doing this. So the question is now, how do you make it discoverable? How do you manage it? How do you assign it? How do you bake it into your onboarding once you have, a lot of this, so that you know who's taken it, who hasn't, and where they are in the process, and so forth. So we actually have a little pamphlet on how that works. So we'll follow up with you on that as well. So. Any other questions, comments, feedback? So Betty says, general question about optimizing for remote onboarding and increasing remote engagement. Any tips? Yeah, we talk about that in TechKnowCon quite a bit. We're sharing stories from companies. And what we've seen when the pandemic started, the pendulum swung from live to self-paced because it was suddenly very attractive. People are all over, anyone can do it on their own time zone, and so on. The downside of that is that you're now even more isolated. So whereas before you join a company, you go into the office and you get indoctrinated in the culture. Now we just FedEx you a laptop, and there's zero human touch, right? And so what organization, Netflix actually did a talk on this where they realized that very quickly, and they swung the pendulum back to the middle. So certain things that are matter of fact, they may do based on self-paced. So for example, I was using engineering onboarding, which is actually very similar to how they do it. So, if you kind of think about set up your development environment, well, that's a matter of fact. You just need to do following things to set it up. And it's fine if this is self-paced, right? And certain things that are sort of okay, we have a video on how to do microservices. It's just a nugget of knowledge, incremental. But then things that are sort of indoctrinating you into the culture, high fidelity, you want to ask questions, you're probably going to be tripping up on stuff and need to be unstuck. And for example, engineering bootcamp would be a great example of that. Or every company has some kind of security training or being on call. These are great things to do live and indoctrinate people in culture, help them connect with one another, understand the team dynamics, etc., as opposed to just dump content to them. So those are some best practices that we are observing from companies out there that are doing this well. Yeah. Any other questions, comments, concerns, or feedback? This is our first time we're running this particular workshop. Yeah. So super thankful for you all coming. I'll follow up just to hear how it went, and if you have any other questions and so on, and distribute the slide deck as well. In the meantime, thank you, really appreciate it.